Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing a very much well-requested video. We are talking about how I got my job in corporate America at Microsoft. For those of you who are new here, my name is Sarah. I am 23 years old. I am a hardware manufacturing engineer at Microsoft. I work on Microsoft's cloud technology, Azure. And as a hardware manufacturing engineer, I work on the intersection between design of the hardware and bring up the manufacturing line of the hardware for everything that goes into the data center. So that's like servers, cables, racks, all that good stuff. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I graduated from the University of Michigan in May of 2019. I majored in mechanical engineering and I minored in computer science. I got my offer for Microsoft in December of 2018, so this was in my senior year. I did not intern at Microsoft, and then I later started my full-time job at the end of July 2019. I'm recording this in August of 2020, so it's been a little over a year at Microsoft, and it's been a positive experience. But today I'm going to tell you the story about my job search, how I interviewed, how I applied to Microsoft, all the process of getting here, and sharing my tips for along the way. I'm making this video focused on my personal experience and tips that helped me along the way. But if you want more of a general, concrete advice video and potentially a resume critique live on video, let me know in the comments below and I can make that happen. Getting started, let's set the scene. So going back in time a little bit, it's September 2018. I am a senior in college. Senior year is just starting at the University of Michigan. Towards the end of September is when we usually have our career fair. If you go to a big school, you probably have a career fair as well. But if you're not in college or your college doesn't have a career fair is basically an event where all these companies come in, they set up booths, and students line up to talk to recruiters and representatives from that company to learn about open positions, pitch themselves, hand them resumes, kind of like a live open job portal. So career fair was happening. I was standing in very long lines throughout this week, especially for those big companies like the tech companies. You stand in those lines for upwards of 5 hours to get a 30-second slot to speak to a recruiter. So yeah, I was doing that. And some of these companies have a private event that is industry or major focus. So for example, Microsoft was having an event that was recruiting for its cloud department supply chain. And I remember my friend asking me to go to this event with her, and as a mechanical engineer, I was not interested in applying to the supply chain, so I was hesitant, and she told me, worst case scenario, you go there, you eat some good food because they had free food. So I went with her to this event, and lucky for me, there was a recruiter there with a hardware background. He actually studied mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan as well. So this leads me to tip number 1. I would highly recommend going to all these companies' recruiting events, even if they are for an industry that you are not necessarily interested in or for a major that you are not in, because this recruiting event that I went to was definitely targeted for industrial operation engineers and the supply chain. But little did I know, and now I know this being on the other side, in Microsoft's organization at the time that I was interviewing and applying, manufacturing was under the supply chain umbrella. Now my organization has reorganized, and this happens often, but you never know where the department you're interested in is rested in a company's organization, so I would go explore, talk to people, and learn more about that as well. Going into the career fair, I was looking for either a mechanical design role or a mechanical manufacturing role. So supply chain wasn't really in my vision of what I was expecting. But basically, I talked to this guy with a hardware background at the recruiting event. Didn't really think much about it. We had a good conversation. I gave him my little elevator pitch that I had prepared, handed him my resume, and left the event feeling full from the good free food. Now that I'm on the other side and I have friends that go to colleges to help recruit, basically what happens is these recruiters receive your resume and they go behind the scenes to divide up into a yes pile, a maybe pile, and a no pile. And then based on the amount of open positions or budget they have, you get a call back, email back for the next interview. So it was about 2 to 3 weeks later, I had almost forgotten about this experience when I got an email asking if I was interested in a phone interview. And I was so ecstatic because at this point in my life, I put all these big tech companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft in a category in my head that I thought was completely out of my league. So I was very excited to get this opportunity to have a phone interview. considering I thought these companies were out of my league, I over-prepared. I reviewed every single class, Googled all the popular interview questions from Microsoft, and prepared a story for each item on my resume on how I would speak about it. So that leads me to tip number 2, is to prepare a story for each item on your resume. If you think about an interview, you have 30 minutes to an hour to tell your entire story about who you are, what skills you have, what you can offer, how you work, and you can't rely on the interviewer to ask you the right questions to get that communication across. So what I did in the past and would recommend doing is I typed up a story for each experience on my resume. For some experiences, I even had multiple stories depending on what I was anticipating the interviewer would ask and what I would want to communicate in response, what kind of skills I offered, what the story would show about how I worked, what the story would show about what I can do, all those kinds of things. And to add on to that, I studied all the storytelling archetypes before my interview so that I could make my stories to each experience in my resume engaging. That way it's an enjoyable experience to both my interviewer and myself, because I think when you can engage the interviewer in a story, it makes you stand out a little bit more. But yeah, I did type out a story for each of my resumes, and I went to the extent of memorizing each story so that when it came to the interview, I had the whole story memorized in my head, and then I could pick and drop certain sentences that I want to include or adapt. I would not recommend reciting your story because that would definitely sound scripted. I think there are levels of memorization, right? You can memorize it to a point where you can recite it as a script, and then the next level of memorization is when you know it so well, back and forth like the back of your hand, you can pick and drop sentences as you go. Which sounds like a lot of preparation, but it's worth it, trust me. Because when you go into an interview, if you get nervous, you can go into autopilot and have that as a plan B. So I went into the phone interview, and it was honestly very relaxed. It was just a conversation where my interviewer asked me who I was. We walked through each item on my resume, my experiences, my skills. We didn't go into any technical questions. Honestly, after the phone interview, I didn't think it went that well, so I thought this is the end of the journey for me. I find phone interviews very difficult. We spoke over each other a lot, and I thought it just didn't flow very well. But luckily, about 2 to 3 weeks later, I got an email inviting me to an on-site interview. So again, overly ecstatic, completely taken aback. I don't know why my confidence was so low at this point, but I was very excited to get an on-site interview. Honestly, that was one of my biggest goals at the time, to just get one of those interviews where the company flies you out to one of your dream cities, aka Seattle or San Francisco for me, and you get to meet the people at the company, you interview with them, and you also get to explore the city. So fast forward about 2 to 3 weeks later, at this point it's been about a month and a half since the first encounter at the career fair, and I'm flying out to Seattle for the on-site interview. It was a very cushy interview experience. I think that's what tech companies like to do. They do like to woo you a little bit. So I had the whole flight, they gave you a rental car, you had a budget for food. I was definitely spoiled. In my preparation, I did 2 things. I reviewed technical information and prepared for the behavioral questions. For the technical questions, I went back to every class and wrote a 1-page summary of the biggest learnings from that class. This honestly wasn't too bad because this is how I studied in the past. I used to just summarize every chapter with a page summary. So I just summarized that even further. And I would recommend this. I don't think you need to memorize any formulas, but if you're presented with, let's say, a beam bending problem for my mechanical engineers, if you know what direction to head if in the interview you can ask for the right equation, then that's the amount of level you should be prepared for. That's my recommendation from my experience. So a little disclaimer there. I know some companies have a lot bigger of a technical element in their interviews, so I would do my own research on what kind of technical questions or the depth of how technical they get in their interview beforehand. I remember researching all the behavioral questions they were going to ask at Microsoft, and the internet had this whole form of trick questions Microsoft asked you. Like, for example, I remember reading one that someone was apparently asked, why are manhole covers round? And I was never asked any trick questions like that in my interview. But being on the other side now, I can see the only reason they would ask that would not to see if you can get the answer right, but to see how you think. If you are asked a question, why is the manhole cover round, or something that you just have no idea about, I would just talk your thoughts out loud. So for example, if I was asked, why is a manhole cover round? I would say, well, the purpose of a manhole is to prevent people or animals or other objects from falling into this underground pipe access point. So key components to that functionality is for it to be sturdy, maybe for it to be cheap to manufacture and produce if they need a lot of them, possibly light for packaging and transportation, although I don't think that is the biggest necessity. And also the lid shouldn't fall into the hole. And then you might be like, oh, ding, 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 that's why. That's the answer that I found online, at least, that it's round because round manhole cover lids can't fall into the hole. Although in my research, I did find some rectangular manhole covers, so I don't know anymore. I think you get the gist of it. Just I would recommend thinking your thoughts out loud, presenting, what is the purpose of this? What are key components needed for this? Here are my questions, so on. I think it's even best to involve your interviewer in the process, bounce some ideas back and forth between the two of you. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Now, for the behavioral aspect of the interview, I made sure, like I said earlier, to prepare a story for each item on my resume. And for starters, a good way to tell a story or a good structure to use is the STAR format, which basically S stands for describing the situation, T is describing the task at hand, A is the action you took, and R is the result. So I can do a little example of this. One of the items on my resume was that I was the co-creator, co-founder of Fettle. Fettle is basically this product that my friend David and I invented. It's a combination of a thermos and a kettle. It's a thermos bottle that has kettle functionality so that you can boil water or make coffee anywhere on the go. So if an interviewer were to ask me, tell me a little bit about Fettle, I would respond with probably something like the following, which, disclaimer, it's been a little over a year, so this might be a little rusty, but I'm gonna give it my best go. So, Sarah, tell me a little bit about, what is this on your resume? Fettle. Yes. It was my sophomore year in college, and I noticed that a lot of my family friends that would come visit from China would always carry around a thermos of hot water with them, and they would be really struggling to make it last throughout the entire day. And this is because a lot of people in many regions of China are used to exclusively drinking hot to warm water. The belief is that the water you consume and put inside your body should be relatively close to the temperature inside of your body. So whenever my family friends would come visit, they would dread running out of water. They didn't want to drink from the cold water fountains that you see around the US because to them it was harmful to their health, harmful to the balance that they believed in. So this is when I went to my friend David, who's also a mechanical engineer, with the idea to create a thermos that also operated like a kettle so that you could boil water anywhere, so that you could go to a water fountain, fill up on the cold water, and then heat it up to your liking. So David and I got to working on our first prototype. We had to teach ourselves everything from how to wire our first circuit. I remember when we got our first heating element working, we stuck a piece of bread from our sandwich on it and it burned, and we got so excited. That was a monumental moment. And eventually we got to the point where we had a minimal viable prototype, and we recognized that we could potentially build this into a business, get the product manufactured and sell it. That's when we also realized that as two sophomore engineers, we had no business experience. So we spent a little time trying to recruit a business major onto our team, and unfortunately it was unsuccessful. So that's when we started dividing up tasks, and I took on the business role. This is when I started teaching myself everything from how to write a business plan, how to create a financial forecast, how to pitch to investors. And I did this through researching online and also by digging through resources offered on campus. I eventually found myself in an amazing entrepreneurship community and went to multiple pitching competitions where I pitched our product to investors. We got some money, and that funded our future prototypes. In that version of the story I told about Fettle, I was trying to highlight how I learn fast, I'm good at self-teaching, I'm adaptable to different roles, and I'm observant in noticing the problems my family friends were facing, and I take initiative when I went to my friend to present the idea and start building a prototype. And I think that's a good mindset to have when you have a story prepared. You should really read it back or have someone else read it and tell you what skills they can pull out from your story, or what does your story tell about the way you work. So that leads me to tip number 6. I would highly recommend having an entrepreneurial experience on your resume. And entrepreneurial experience doesn't have to be your typical, you have a product, you sell it online, or you develop or invent a product. It could be a nonprofit, it could be an organization, a social experiment, anything. I think the benefits of entrepreneurial experiences is that you get to wear a lot of different hats. You get to learn so many different things that you can talk about in your interview. It also presents you with a lot of opportunities where you have to teach yourself adapt, fulfill different roles, and also get some business experience, because I know that's also important in any role in corporate America. Even if you are an engineer, it's important to also have that business perspective, because in the end, your goal is to work to generate a profit for the company. So anyways, back to the story. I'm in Seattle now. I am here for my on-site interview, and I go in to my day of interviews. I remember walking into this building on Microsoft's campus and being so overwhelmed, because I think about 50 people were leaving the building. As 50 people, including me, was walking in. They were interviewing us in batches, and just seeing the number of candidates that were there was kind of intimidating. But I hunkered down. We were all waiting in the lobby. How they organized it was each of us would have 4 interviews, and from the back someone would come out, call your name, and you'd follow them to the back for your interview. You come back out, you have about 10 to 15 minutes to recoup, go to the bathroom, and then your next interviewer would call you and take you to the back. So I sat in the lobby, meeting people, talking to people. I also had my packet of summaries from all the classes I had taken before, and also a packet of all the stories I wrote for each experience on my resume. So I was reviewing those while I was waiting to be called back to interviews. Eventually, the first person to interview me called me, and we went to the back, and it is an understatement when I say everyone who interviewed me was so friendly. And I can say this is true about Microsoft overall. Working at Microsoft, I've met the nicest, the friendliest people working here, so I'm just grateful for that. My first interview was more technical. We went through experiences on my resume. In one of my previous internships, I designed a manufacturing line, so he asked me about that. I drew it out on the whiteboard. That leads me to my next tip, to always draw out things that you're explaining. Even if you are bad at drawing, prepare what you're going to draw ahead of time. Practice drawing it before you go into the interview. If there's a whiteboard, draw on that. If not, bring paper and pen as backup just in case. But what I did was I drew out the manufacturing line I had designed, and he asked me questions about it. Why didn't you do this? Why did you do this? And honestly, it was a great conversation. We bounced ideas off each other. It went very smooth, and it was a great experience. The second interview I went into, I think what happened was my original interviewer had a conflict, so they had to backfill someone last minute. Because I remember going into this interview, and the guy had just kind of like leaned back in his chair and asked me, "So, tell me about yourself. Who is Sarah?" Basically, he didn't really have any interview questions prepared, but honestly, I gotta say, this is the one question I did not prepare for, so I was a little stumped. It's almost like he triggered an entire existential crisis in that moment. I was sitting there thinking, who is Sarah? But, eventually after warming up, I got into the groove a little bit. If you need time to think, ask the interviewer questions back about them too. It makes the conversation more fun if you're not the only one talking anyways. Then it was time for interview number 3. And interviewer number 3 asked me a lot about the items on my resume. There was a stronger emphasis on the behavioral questions. So we talked about this research project I did where I helped a professor prototype and design a medical device. I drew the device on the board, explained how it worked, asked me questions along the lines of why did you do this, why didn't you do this, and presented me with hypothetical scenarios about my project that I would answer that were mostly behavioral related. For example, asking me what's the hardest technical difficulty you've ever faced, what is the hardest time you've had with a team member in a team project, and how did you go about that? Those kinds of questions. I think these are all very common interview questions. And another tip, inserting it here, whenever you are asked a question about any negative experiences you've had with a team member or in a team environment, I would approach explaining it from an aspect of empathy for the other person that you didn't get along with or their situation. So the first interview was technical based on my previous experiences. The second interview was just a fun conversation about who I was. The third interview was a little technical about previous projects I had worked on, but also strongly behavioral, presenting hypothetical situations. And the fourth interview I'm about to go into was, I remember the first question he asked was, if you could redesign any Microsoft product, which one would you redesign? So definitely go into interviews for a company being familiar with their product. I was surprised by this question for sure. I didn't prepare for it. Started thinking out loud a little bit, thinking, well, these are the products I've personally used, and I started talking about the Surface tablet. I said how I loved that it was a blend between a laptop and a tablet, but the one issue I had with it is that it seems so clunky. If you've seen the Surface tablet before, In order to make it stand, you have to pull out this back tab, and that's what makes it stand upright. And I remember being in the campus tech store, playing around with the giant Surface desktop and how smooth it was. If you've seen it in stores, you know what I'm talking about. It's this giant screen that has beautiful hinges. It just floats down and floats up, and it even has a dial you can turn to scroll or adjust the paint color if you're in the painting app. And I talked about how there was a discrepancy between the two. Here you had the Surface tablet with its clunky hinges and mechanisms to stand, and you had the Surface desktop that almost floated like a cloud up and down. So I talked about redesigning the Surface tablet with these hinges so that you could fold it up and expand it as smoothly as the Surface desktop did. So I drew this on the whiteboard. Lucky for me, this was my forte, designing products at the moment, so I was thriving, honestly having a lot of fun. I absolutely loved participating in makeathons, time-constrained environments where you have to design and produce a minimal viable prototype, so I was really in my element here. Another thing that stuck out about this interview was he asked me a question that I'm pretty sure he was confident I wouldn't know the answer to. He presented a hypothetical scenario about a study that we wanted to do, and basically asked me a statistics question about how would I go about validating the study and coming to a conclusion. At this time, I didn't have any statistics on my transcript, so that's what makes me think that he knows I didn't know the answer to it. And I think his goal was to see how I think, how I work, and how I go about figuring something out that I don't know the answer to. And my best advice for that is, again, to just think out loud. So I talked out loud about, okay, so the goal is this. These are our resources, and here's what I know, here's what I don't know. What do you think about X, Y, Z? So definitely okay to ask your interviewer questions. And honestly, he ended up explaining the entire answer to me, but we had a good back and forth conversation in the process. So those were all 4 of my interviews on site. I felt pretty good after the interviewing experience. I thought they went pretty well, mostly because I was just having a lot of fun. I really liked the questions they asked, and I think it was a lot less stressful because of how prepared I was for it. I didn't feel I was super prepared before the first interview, but when the interviewer started asking me questions and I just knew it off the back of my hand, I had all these stories prepared. The interviewers were so friendly, everything felt like a back and forth conversation. So I left the interview feeling pretty good. So I interviewed in early November, and usually I think the process is you find out anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks, but in 2 to 3 weeks it was the holiday season. I didn't end up finding out until mid to late December that I got the offer, and I'm still so grateful for that moment. I'm grateful for all the interviewers that took the time to talk to me and listen to my story, and that I'm able to be here in this position to help you all prepare for these interviews and how you can go in feeling confident. That concludes my story and my interviewing experience. I'll leave you all with one final tip is before going into the interview with the company, do research on the company and try to do enough research such that you can describe the company as a person. And what I mean by that is if this company was a person, what kind of personality would they have? What kind of values do they have? What are they passionate about? That way, when you go into the interview, you can show how your values, how your goals align with that of the company. So for example, for Microsoft, I would describe them as very empathetic, with a strong entrepreneurial mindset, with the goal to do a lot of humanitarian things around the world. Let me know if you'd like to see another video that's a bit more technical. For example, what I would recommend having on your resume, going more in depth in how to prepare these stories, and let me know in the comments below. Other than that, thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like if you found the video useful or you enjoyed watching. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. Any questions you have, I'd love to answer them. And subscribe for more. I post videos about career, entrepreneurship, vlogs, lifestyle, all that good stuff. It's a good time here. Alright, talk to you later. Bye.
Young age, trying to make a bit. Now that I'm up, they all on my dick. No contractors, never thrown a brick. Just trying to keep it cool like it's ice on my wrist. God-given talent, been feeling blessed. Kept it 100 like an Asia's math test. Balling all day, I got it on lock. The way I'm flexing on them, you can call me the Rock.